Hi, thanks for coming. I'm going to talk for about 18 minutes give you a very, very high-level description of what the Clean Power Plan looks like in its final form. And then I'm going to focus in on sort of one of two issues that we're going to talk about. The litigation questions, right? As John mentioned, the final rule for covering existing sources was published, and the final rule covering new sources. These are two separate rules, as we'll talk about in a minute. Were published in the Federal Register on Friday, and today the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the court of first instance for challenges to rules of this sort, consolidated all 20, count them, 20 lawsuits that were filed on Friday, including challenges from, I think, 26 states, but there'll probably be more, into one case. And it's going to hear that case. There's a stay motion, a motion to stop the rule in its tracks and stop implementation. And then there's a challenge on the merits. And it's going to handle all of that in due course. And probably, realistically speaking, given the number of states involved, this is something that the Supreme Court will hear in due time. So what's in the plan? First of all, what is the plan? The plan is rate and mass-based limits for CO2 emissions from existing fossil-fueled power plants, coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired combined cycle power plants. Is that a big deal or not? On the one hand, I'm going to argue it's not. On the other hand, I'm going to argue it is. I'll just talk you through that in a few minutes here. So on the one hand, not a big deal. The reason is that the stringency of the plan is not that high. So this figure here, I'm going to try to use my pointer. This figure is just a chart that shows GDP, US GDP, and total electricity sales. And what you can see is that this extends from 1950 out to 2014, I believe. And what you can see is that over time, GDP starts out, or electricity sales start out as a strong function of GDP, but that relationship has decayed, and that in particular, since the recession, there's really no relationship between GDP and electricity sales. Another way to look at this data is in terms of the growth rate of electricity. This just shows the percentage growth, annual growth in electricity sales as a function of time from 1950 to present. You can see it's falling through time, starting out very high. This is sort of like China-like growth, right? And then, or something we would recognize in the modern day, in modern context in China. And then it's falling, falling, falling until today we're at about zero load growth. EIA, because they're optimistic folks, tend to project modest load growth to the future. But if you just fit a line through this trend, you see it going negative in the future. Recognize that the Clean Power Plan compliance is out here at 2030. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how much electricity we're going to need in 2030. I'm not saying that the number's right to be down here. It might be up there. It might be down there. In either case, this plan doesn't ask for a lot, either in terms of, especially if the compliance with the plan is on a mass basis, on a tons per year basis. That's because if electricity sales fall, right, there's fewer electricity sales over which to spread those carbon emissions, and that's going to allow existing coal units to keep running if they want to, if the economics otherwise support it. So maybe this plan isn't such a big deal. There are people in the community who have advocated for it who will tell you that, who will say it's a modest plan. It's not really going to require very much. It's going to require business as usual plus a little bit. There's transformation happening in the electricity sector anyway, because for lots of reasons. And that transformation is going to happen, and what this plan does is kind of lock that down. On the other hand, this is a big deal. And the reason that it's a big deal is that this is the first time under US law that anything has been regulated because of its carbon emissions. Now you might say, what about cars? We got a tailpipe emissions rule. That was like the beginning of the Obama administration. That's like ancient history probably for some of the students in the room. That rule, though, was a collaboration between EPA and NHTSA and was as much oriented at fuel economy as CO2 emissions. This is the first time that CO2 emissions only are being regulated. And that is an important distinction, and it's a distinction that matters. What's more, if this rule survives challenge, if it's implemented along the lines that Diane's going to tell us about, it's going to lay down a framework. It's going to lay down a set of processes and rules and approaches that can be used later if and when more stringent targets are applied, right? So what's going to be challenged right now is the means of setting the goals, the sort of design process for setting a target, and probably also the methods by which the targets will be achieved, the degree to which EPA can specify how states achieve a particular target that EPA sets. Now, both of those things are kind of independent of a target. As circumstances change, as the economics make reducing carbon emissions even easier than it is to do that today, EPA has legal authority to lower the cap. And if one looks at the international commitments that the US is currently making, there's a lot of reason to think that down the road, a few years, EPA might want to do that. So maybe a big deal, maybe not a big deal. Depends on your perspective. The cup is half full. I think it's reasonable to think the cup is half empty. So what is in the rule? What is this rule? The rule sets targets for states beginning in 2022 and extending to 2030. In 2030, if everyone does what they're supposed to do, emissions will be 32% lower than 2005 levels. Now, of course, emissions today are far below 2005 levels, right? Shale gas, giant economic recession, etc. Much cheaper renewable energy. So we're already about halfway there. So we have to go another half, in essence. And that's the target. The target was developed by EPA using what it calls 3 building blocks. The first one is what people in the power sector call heat rate upgrades. You might think of that as sort of an efficiency upgrade or a fuel economy upgrade for power plants. So things that you can do within a power plant to make it better at turning fuel into electricity. The second, and EPA went out and looked around the country and estimated the degree to which that could reduce emissions in every state of the covered sources, coal and combined cycle gas units. The second source of reductions that EPA finds is what it calls coal to gas redispatch. It looks at states and says, do you have natural gas-fired power plants that are underutilized? Why couldn't you use those more and use coal plants less? To the degree that switch is possible, EPA says those reductions can also be part of this larger target. Finally, EPA assessed the degree to which additional renewable energy could be deployed within, to benefit a state, within a state's region to reduce its use of fossil-fired electricity. And it summed those 3 potential sources of reductions up on a state-by-state basis and came up with this top number, 32% cut. It's important to recognize that implies significant variation across states, depending on, for example, do they have highly efficient, relatively new units that don't have much of an efficiency upgrade that's possible? Do they have underutilized gas units along with coal in the state? What potential do they have for renewables? This is just a map that shows the marginal abatement cost by state in the final rule. It's a little bit hard to see some numbers, so I'm just going to point some out here, unless you're, have better eyesight than I do anyway. So I apologize for that. The key numbers to think about from our perspective is that's a 0 and a 0 in Oregon and Washington, 15 for California, and then higher numbers in the rest of the WEC in general, mid-20s in much of the WEC. So low numbers on the coast, high numbers inland in the Western Interconnect. And a similar variation over here in the Eastern Interconnect where you see lots of zeros, over in the blue states, and much higher numbers in the more red or purple states. Now, if this had been the model result in the draft rule, right, that would have been a non-starter, but this is the final rule. It came out, it's final. There's not much to do about it at this point if you're a red state. But there's a lot of upset about this, a lot of sense of maybe some unfairness. Personally, I think it's, you got to take these results with a grain of salt, particularly at the state level. So last slide on the nitty-gritty, and because I'm going to go quickly through this because there's enormous flexibility, I'm sorry, because Diane's going to cover this in detail. There's enormous flexibility for states in terms of how they comply. I'll just go through a quick survey of some of the dimensions along which states get to make choices about how they comply with this rule. One is they can either comply on a tons per megawatt hour basis, that's called a rate-based approach, or a tons per year, that's called a mass-based approach. To me, they both kind of sound like rates, right? There's a numerator and denominator, but they call them rate and mass, fine. States get to choose. They get to choose whether existing sources, which are what's covered by the rule, are what's covered, or existing plus new sources. They can put the new sources into the rule, sources that are constructed between now and 2030 into the rule that would otherwise be covered by the existing source rule. They can trade. You can have cap and trade programs with one state or with regions or potentially with states that are across the country. So there's enormous flexibility for trading. There's provisions for regional cooperation. Cooperation especially within electricity market regions to try to make the carbon compliance consistent with the design of electricity markets. And then finally, there are provisions for states like California that might just kind of want to go it on their own. They have a complex set of climate policies, and they might want to do their own thing and know and make a showing that that's going to be good enough and keep the feds out of their business. In particular, not make their state climate policies federally enforceable. Those are called state resources plans. So there's lots of choices that states have to make, and it's complicated to know what to do. Diane's going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the fork in the road. States have to choose whether to litigate or comply or do both. In practice, most states are doing both. There are only 5 states, I think, that have said nothing about complying at this point. Amongst the 26, 30, I don't know quite how many, are going to litigate. Almost everybody else, the vast majority, are starting to have discussions about compliance. And the next couple of years are going to be critical for that as the lawsuit is playing out. So what about the litigation? There are 4 key legal questions, I would argue. One is, does the new source rule stand? Does it survive challenge? There's a rule that was published simultaneously with this existing source rule that covers sources to be built in the future. That rule has to be legal for the existing source rule to be allowed. Existing source rules are only allowed once there's a new source rule. There's what I'll call the dueling statutes issue. I'll explain what that is in a second. There's the beyond the fence line issue. That's the use by EPA of reductions that are available from the system, the electricity system, rather than from within the fence line, that is at a power plant, at the power plant being regulated. And there's the FDA v. Brown and Williamson issue, which is basically, well, I'll get there. So what's the new source question? Section 111 allows EPA to regulate new stationary sources and allows regulation of existing stationary sources, which is what the Clean Power Plan does, only after there's a new source rule. So essentially, existing sources can be regulated if they would be covered by a new source rule were they new. So you need to have a new source rule first. The new source rule that EPA arrived at requires partial carbon capture and storage for coal-fired power plants. The legal standard for covering this new source rule is the best system of emissions reduction that has been adequately demonstrated taking cost into account. So the question that the court is going to face is is carbon capture and storage, like the Kemper County plant, pictured here under construction, adequately demonstrated for coal plants? And I think there are a diversity of views on that, and reasonable people can come down on either side. The Kemper plant is now at $6.2 billion and counting. It was initially a $2.1 billion facility. Southern is injecting capital into Mississippi Power to keep it afloat, and Mississippi Power has been cut off from the credit markets because of this project. So there's a question mark there about adequate demonstration. On the other hand, there are reasons to think that CCS is a well-understood technology and has been used in many applications and at pilot scale. So we're going to have to see whether a court defers to EPA's judgment on that. Next problem, the dueling statutes issue. So unfortunately, when the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments were adopted, the House and Senate versions of the bill both modified Section 111D, the part of the Clean Air Act that, upon which the Clean Power Plan is based. Both versions, which differ from each other in important ways, as it turns out, were enacted into law by the reconciliation process. So we have two versions of the same section of the Clean Air Act. And the question is, which one controls? One version would allow for regulations of power plant carbon dioxide. The other would not. EPA has decided that the version control that allows for CO2 regulation at power plants is the right one to follow. And EPA has a pretty good argument for that. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but the question is EPA right? We'll find out. What's the beyond the fence line issue? The goals, as I mentioned, for the Clean Power Plan were set based upon an emission standard that reflects the best system of emission reduction. And the question for EPA and the court, and that a lot of the states are really upset about, is whether that can include actions that don't occur at the regulated source. In the past, typically, these kinds of emissions rate standards have been based upon a control technology that can be installed at the source. Like in the case of that kind of source, that's Plant Bowen in Georgia, flue gas desulfurization, right? Scrubbers. In this rule, EPA has said, well, you might do some heat rate improvements, but it's also said, but we're going to get most of the reductions from shifting utilization within the system, the machine that is the electricity grid, right? That's treating the electricity system as a single machine for purposes of defining the goals of this rule. The question is whether that is an appropriate, a legal, a reasonable interpretation of the language that gives EPA authority to set standards under the rule. And I think we don't know what a court's going to say. In particular, what a particular court with 9 justices is going to say about that one. Last issue, and then I'm going to sit down and let Diane take over, is the FDA v. Brown and Williamson issue. So this is Bill Clinton surrounded by, I think Commissioner Kessler is maybe that guy. This is basically the health-related cabinet members of the Clinton administration saying, we're getting tough on cigarettes. In particular, they attempted to regulate cigarettes, you may remember this, as a drug delivery device, right? Like a syringe. Now, this attempt to regulate got up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked at it and said, hold on a minute. That just doesn't make sense. The cigarettes have been around for 50 years. Congress has been passing laws about cigarettes during that time. And they've never indicated, Congress has never indicated that they think of cigarettes as covered by the authorizing legislation for the Food and Drug Administration. So we're not going to let the FDA change its interpretation on a dime because they feel like it and basically ban cigarettes or potentially ban. The FDA wasn't really trying to do that, but they were sort of trying to. They were trying to ban cigarettes for kids. Horrible idea, right? So what the Supreme Court said in this case was, we expect Congress to speak clearly if it wishes to assign an agency decisions of vast economic and political significance. the Supreme Court has referenced that language several times in the last couple of years with respect to Obama administration regulatory decisions. In particular, the UARG decision, which concerned earlier EPA attempts to change the permitting for new major stationary sources of greenhouse gas emissions. They struck that rule down. And most recently, actually, to uphold an Obama administration regulatory action in the King v. Burwell case, which was the ACA, the Affordable Care Act case from this summer. They looked at that statute and they said, you know what? If an exchange is run by a state or the federal government, it's clear that Congress intended to allow the tax subsidies to flow to people who take advantage of that, and we're not going to basically undermine the entire statutory framework because of a small drafting error. And they relied on this FDA v. Brown and Williamson case. There is a significant possibility, and certainly it's raised by all the challengers in those 20 lawsuits from Friday, that this issue may determine the outcome, right? That the court is going to look at what EPA has done here and said, you're trying to essentially accomplish national cap and trade policy via regulation. Didn't Congress consider a bill something like that in 2009? Yes, they did, and they didn't pass it. And this is exactly the kind of decision about which we shouldn't allow EPA to find elephants in mouse holes, right? So with that, I just, in conclusion, say there's a lot of uncertainty. Former student Richard Morse, who works at Citigroup, likes to say his shadow price for carbon is between $0 and $50 per ton. Pick your number until all these questions are resolved. If EPA loses, they're likely to lose big. However, EPA will still retain authority to regulate on this question, almost with significant likelihood. So what that means is delay, right? This is about delay. Can the day of reckoning for fossil fire generation, where there is liability, be delayed a few more years? Remains to be seen. I'm going to hand it over to Diane.
Great, thanks. So I'm now part two, which will it just? Set you up. Oh, okay. Part two, and I'm going to be addressing two aspects. One is, given the incredible complexity and given all the uncertainty, what the heck are the states actually doing in the here and now? Because this whole scheme ends up being, as Michael said, that EPA has set goals for 48 out of the 50 states, right? We don't have Hawaii and we don't have Alaska. And each state then has to file a compliance plan. So that's the first question. What are the states doing? And then the second thing I'm going to talk about is energy efficiency, because that is viewed as one of the compliance options. So why am I starting with two? I guess I'm back to one. We actually did review each other's slides, but as a former lawyer, I couldn't resist. Step one of what the states are doing is, in fact, bringing in the lawyers. This is a map that was as of October 22nd, so it may not have picked up everything, but the orange states are the ones that are considering the compliance options. The white states are the ones that are, white states are the ones not pursuing litigation. The blue is still reviewing it and not deciding what they're going to do. And then the gray are the ones that said they are not, or they're threatening not to develop a plan. So exactly what Michael said, which is you have a lot of states who have said we're suing. A lot of states have sued. But the number of states that have actually said we're just going to sit this one out are not actually that many. And in part it's because EPA has also promulgated a draft. It's still draft, right, Michael? It's got 90-day comment now. Yeah. That will be a federal rule. And so if a state does not submit its own plan, EPA, being no dummies, have said, we'll do one for you. So that's definitely a bit of a stick for the states to say, we may be fighting this in court, but let's go ahead and at least get a plan we can live with. So these are just some of the key questions. Michael's gone over them. I'm not going to address them in detail, but just to let you know, threshold question, are you doing mass or are you doing rate? Leakage to new sources, especially under the mass base. We're going to be having some level of new power plants probably. What are you doing about those new sources? There's something called the Emission Reduction Credit, ERC, under the rate base, and that's where you basically are issuing for the various covered entities in your states that have emissions under the plan or emission reductions. And you've got to think about how you're going to be approaching those. Collaboration I'm going to talk about, and then the model rules in the federal plan. Those are up for comment. What do the states want to say? So after you've finished talking with your lawyers, then the next thing the states are doing is talking among themselves. And I just put together the list for California of who it is. We start with the governor. In each state, the governor is the person that's going to sign off on the plan. We have our air quality czar, Mary Nichols, who will be overseeing the plan development. We have in California our Air Resources Board, 11 people plus Mary. They will formally vote on the plan. We have 35 separate local air quality districts in California. And this matters because, in fact, power plants produce many pollutants, and you have to think about what's going to be the structure for complying with the other aspects of the Federal Clean Air Act and not just the carbon. We, of course, have our legislature. We have the Public Utilities Commission that oversees the investor-owned utilities and also funding for many of these programs. The Energy Commission in California, we have a split between the investor-owned utilities, who have about 75% of electricity use. We have municipal utilities. We have over 60 separate municipal utilities in California. I'm now down to our independent system operator that operates wholesale markets, now expanding out in the West. We have state and federal power developers. We have independent power producers, renewable developers, all the clean power folks. We have the environmental justice and low-income community, because EPA has issued something called the Clean Energy Incentive Program, CEIP, which actually gives additional allowance credits if a state goes in and does renewables or energy efficiency in low-income communities. So there's a lot of interest now in what's going to happen with that. And then finally, we have the public. So you can see from a state's viewpoint, when it's trying to figure out both politically, technically, and on an economic basis what to do, and in its filings, it has to show the consultation that it's had. There's a lot going on. Third step, after you've talked within your state, then it's time to meet your neighbors. This plan, one way or another, is fundamentally about acknowledging the realities of the fact that we have in the United States a very interconnected electric grid. Power is flowing across the borders. Many utilities operate in multiple states. We've got wholesale markets. There's a definite slant in the rule to try to encourage interstate trading compliance, because almost all the studies show if the states can trade off against one another in terms of emission reductions and what credits are, the costs are going to go down. Everybody's going to benefit. So there's a big push to try to make that happen. And just again, because of the way our system's set up, if you're looking at costs as well as reliability, you have to understand what's going on in your other states. I'm not going to try and go through this, but this is why we end up with interstate trading. EPA's come up with a concept called trading ready under either mass or rate base. And then you can either go with specified partner states, you could actually do a joint multi-state plan, you can do individual plans. So there's lots of options that are available in the rule, but they all involve in some way interacting with other states. And they don't just need to be your neighboring states, what Michael said. I mean, you can have Nevada deciding they're going to do something with Ohio. There's not necessarily any requirement on the geographical proximity. Here is some of the research that I pulled together of what's going on, that we can end up, you think of the West, the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Southeast. And all 4 areas have ongoing collaborations now where they're at least pulling together. Remember my list of what I put down of who's involved. Generally, the air quality regulators in the state, what are called the economic regulators, the commissioners with the Public Utilities Commission, usually the utilities, usually somebody from the governor's office, and they're having these fairly, as you can imagine, large-scale meetings. So we have in the West 13 states. We're very different of how we're looking at things. That in the West, it's vertically integrated utilities. The entity that's leading it is the Center for the New Energy Economy. Last year with Michael, we ran a series on 111D, and we had former Governor of Colorado, Bill Ritter, come and talk, and he's the one who's heading up this effort in that state. And they're actually doing modeling compliance for a number of the Western states. In the Midwest, it's very complicated. There's 14 states, some of whom are in a vertically integrated, a wholesale market, MISO, but some of which are not and are vertically integrated. And so just having those discussions is proving to be a challenge. The Mid-Atlantic, that's 13 states plus the District of Columbia, that's not generally a wholesale market. It's rather a competitive, it's not generally integrated. It's competitive retail. It's got 1,400 power plants just in the footprint of these states, some of whom are in a wholesale market, PJM, and some of whom aren't. This is the variation in coal usage in those 14 states, going from 96%, I think that's West Virginia, down to 0% coal. So you can imagine those types of discussions of saying, how are we going to get together a plan? Southeast, you've got 9 states, again, tremendous variation between 90 to 15% coal, and in that area, Duke's University Nicholas Institute is gathering together. So what we have is nonprofits who are gathering all of the states together, trying to have these discussions and trying to help the states figure out what to do. There also is tremendous variation in the rules between whether you're choosing rate or mass and whether you're looking at renewable or energy efficiency as a compliance strategies. In some of them, you can rely upon actions outside of your own state. In others, you can't. And so literally just understanding how these different options can affect your state if you're thinking about going with other states is one of the most complex areas. Challenging but not impossible. I'm just going to flip through some of the slides here. This is our interconnected grid in the United States. So you can think about it of all the different power flows, but each individual state has to analyze what are the costs of compliance under various approaches for their own state, and then what are the options of who else they could join with if they wanted to look at joining and trying to lower some of their costs. This is the, just a map of the investor-owned utilities in the United States. And again, it's the utilities as well as private companies, the independent power producers, who have tremendous interest in this rule because it's their power plants. And so they're looking at how they should be thinking about responding and working with states under the Act. Tremendous variation in the clean energy standards. That the purple are those states that have renewable advanced energy provisions and an energy efficiency. The blue is where you're more limited, that you do have renewable and energy efficiency. I think that's blue is just renewables, and the red is energy efficiency only. So you can look at this part of the country, which is the WEC, the Western Interconnection. You know, I was at a conference in Sacramento on Thursday and Friday of last week that brought together many of the regulators and utilities from around the West. And I can't tell you how many times I heard, well, you're California, you're off in your own world on climate. We're the rest of the Western United States. How are we going to reconcile what are very different policies in our state with what you're doing? And I will say one of the themes was, if California is really reducing its emissions, it may have extra allowances that it can sell or give away to other states in the West. And wouldn't that be a nice thing to do, because then it would overall lower emissions? But this is the type of analysis and horse trading that's going to be going on over the next couple of years. So in the West, just real quick summary, lots and lots of interest in trading programs. I've talked to a whole lot of folks in a lot of states. That is sort of the topic of the day. Little interest in giving any control to EPA or the federal, and they recognize that we've got to talk, but it's very costly, very different state policies. This is just a quick snapshot at an effort that's going on in the West that's developing tools that's trying to figure out if you had compliance obligations, how would it affect different utilities and different states and different power plants, and start to give some different scenarios. So this is a type of analysis that we're going to start to surface over the next couple of years. So in my last 5 minutes, I'm going to do energy efficiency. Will it be significant compliance strategy? Bottom line, the answer is definitely out on whether it's going to be or not. Everybody loves energy efficiency, smartest thing to do, least cost, but it is tricky under the Clean Power Plan. It can be used. The final plan has lots of information on how it might be used, but it's very different under the two approaches. Under rate, it's directly creditable, but you have to have very precise measurement and verification of any savings from energy efficiency that a state is claiming. Under mass, it's viewed as a complementary measure where overall it's lowering the emissions in the system, but the state does not need to report that to EPA. And so here again, we're starting to see a lot of interest in the mass-based approach because many of the states believe that they're going to be better able to use energy efficiency if they can go with a mass base because they're not going to have to report each and every project and program and have the risk that EPA says, excuse me, we don't believe your claim is savings, we're going to disallow them, and then the state is left holding the economic bag on going after more emissions. So lots of opportunities still to comment on energy efficiency. There's a draft EMV guidance out that I skimmed actually this morning, 75 pages or 100 pages. It made even me, somebody who's been involved in energy efficiency for 40 years, worry a great deal about what's going to be required. And if you're in a state that's sort of getting used to doing energy efficiency, it sounds a little bit scary of all the information you have to produce and then turn over to EPA and hope that they are going to agree with your results. On the other hand, for policy reasons, EPA really wants states to use energy efficiency for compliance. So I think it will start to shake out, but it's a very big unknown of where we're going to go with it. In the discussions that I've had with many people, energy efficiency just is not an area of focus yet. They're focused on the bigger issues of mass versus rate-based, who within their state do they want to talk to. So my bet is this may almost be a year or so before we get down to the nitty-gritty. Very great concern about the risk if it's a disallowance of claimed savings. And there's a lot of programs where the state may only have done what we call widget-based, a CFL or an LED, where you've got deemed savings based on engineering calculations, whereas there's a much wider range of energy efficiency we can do, but great uncertainty about how would that be counted. These are just some of the key areas of uncertainty on the measuring and verification of energy efficiency savings. Because remember, the name of the game is if you're using energy efficiency, you want to show that that means that you're having to use less fossil-fired power, and therefore you have to know that these savings you're claiming are real. There's inconsistent standards and methods across the states because up to now, energy efficiency has always been done at a state level. It is completely regulated by the state utility commissions or by the utilities. Lots of differences in how we attribute energy efficiency. Is it due to private actions? Is it due to utility programs? And then it's very disaggregated, and the terminologies that we use in the different states vary a lot. So one of the most interesting things that has happened is we have developed in the United States renewable energy credit registries that are all voluntary because our RPSs are done on a state-by-state basis. But the states have gotten together and they've agreed upon how they count renewable power plant that's being built. They have it so that they make sure there's no double counting, because a lot of times with a renewable plant, it may be in one state, but you're selling that renewable to another state, the power to another state, and it may be a third state that gets the credit under an RPS. So we have a track record of where we have these different registries that have been able to come to agreement, and they're considered pretty valid. So what's very interesting is that we have now a proposal for a national energy efficiency registry for the states. A nonprofit organization in San Francisco, the Climate Reserve, or the Climate Registry, which has helped on the carbon registries, is heading it up. They're working with APX, who is sort of the brains behind a lot of the technical running of these renewable registries. They've gotten a DOE grant for about $800,000, and they're just now starting to think about how to have it set up. But their goal is to actually have the launch done by 2018, I think it is. And so this would be a huge step forward in the world of energy efficiency if we could actually have this type of national registry. So with that, I'm all done. I don't know, I won't worry about that. Okay, thank you.
You guys want to come up for
Sure.
questions
Okay.
and answers? We have about 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more.
I'll try it. It's really standing.
Okay. We'll start
Diana
with,
might just show.
We'll start with student questions first for the first few. Student questions.
And we know there are some students out here.
I'll start calling on. Some students must have a question. There we go. Marty, and then up here. Marty.
This question is for Michael. Thanks so much. Thanks so much to both of you for this talk. My question is, you said that if the Supreme Court were to invalidate the Clean Power Plan based on this former ruling related to the FDA, that it would only actually delay the implementation. So how would it be then if the Clean Power Plan were overruled, or the EPA were told that they didn't have this authority? How could they then regulate it in the future?
EPA would have to go back to the drawing board in terms of how they calculate their goals. And they have the authority, my guess, and I think they're, the folks on the industry side will tell you that they think it's probably a done deal, that EPA has authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. The question is, do they have the authority to regulate it in the way that they have chosen to in the Clean Power Plan, which is to look at the system and try to reduce emissions from the system? They would probably have to go back to the drawing board and look at a within the fence line approach. That's the main change. And how ambitious that could be really depends on how creative EPA gets about requiring things within the fence line. They haven't bothered to be very creative this time because they've mostly looked beyond the fence line for reductions.
Up here. And then over there.
I have a question about, I think both of you mentioned that the trading will be decrease the cost of accomplishing these targets, and that they may cost difference by state, but would that be, would that have some influence on whether the target set by the EPA will be challenged or not by the states?
No, let's hear your reaction, but EPA has set the targets and they're just there. And so how the state complies, whether it does trading or just acts within its own state, that won't affect the targets. I think you're also saying, would it be likely that a state might be less likely to challenge the targets themselves if it felt that through trading it could lower the costs? Because there are deadlines for actually filing the lawsuits, I think anyone who thinks they want to challenge the plan is going to go ahead and file a lawsuit, because it's going to be at least a year or two till we really know how well the trading works out.
The other thing I would add is that, somewhat paradoxically, the states that are most opposed to this, they have no interest in reducing their costs with trading, right? They view cap and trade as, cap and tax, And as a sort of trying to push via a regulatory process what the administration couldn't get via a legislative one. So they're not interested.
So I have a question about if we're looking at states that are trading and a state chooses to go the rate route and the other state decides to go the mass route. Now, overall, because you're expecting like a constant or a decreasing electricity consumption, that might be fine. But when these states, if I'm thinking of if there's a population, exodus from one state into the other, and that state that's getting the population is saying we're going to go on a rate route because that just makes more sense for us because our consumption is increasing, whereas the other state, how are they planning to kind of figure that out?
Do you want to take that? Or you want
No, I want you to.
I think gaming that choice has to be the most difficult decision that states have to make, particularly states that aren't very interested in climate policy. They want to make the smart choice, rate versus mass, that's going to minimize their costs. And the tricky part is that minimizing your own costs depends to a significant degree what your neighbors do. So there's a strategic interaction between the choices. But this issue is incredibly important. Just to crystallize it for people, if a state chooses a mass-based approach, natural gas-fired power plants face a carbon price. They face essentially a price for emitting carbon. If they choose a rate-based approach, a natural gas-fired power plant is likely going to be emitting below the rate, so it's actually subsidized. So these choices have dramatic implications for how the electricity grid functions. And there are these interstate competition questions.
And if I could, just real quickly, to take an example of Wyoming, Montana, they're a situation where they have there are not that many people that live there. And yet they have an awful lot of power plants because they're a major exporter of power. They literally cannot on their own just put in place a scheme, especially if it's rate-based, because it doesn't hold up economically. They don't have the population to support what else would be done if you're going to start building a bunch of renewables, et cetera. So to some extent, the differences between the population, how many power plants, is going to force some level of economic viewing of what to do, I think.
One more student question in the back, and then Katie, and then up here.
What are the implications of trading under the CPP for existing trading schemes, particularly like California's, and from both the policy or political and technical standpoint?
California has been very clear that they are not going to weaken their own trading system just to get other people to join in. And one of the things we didn't have time to cover is that the initial plan is due September 2016.
Or file an extension.
But you can file for a 2-year extension. California and Washington State, I think, at least in the West, are the two states who have said, we're going to get in on time, in part because they want to say we support this. So they're not going to be waiting to see which states may join or not join. On the other hand, California always set up its cap and trade system thinking there was going to be a national cap and trade system. So it's going to look very openly at if other states want to come in, but they're going to want to make sure the integrity of the California system is not jeopardized.
Okay, I've been told we have to end really soon, so can I ask Katie and the gentleman over here to ask their questions consecutively, and then you guys can have final words. Katie.
So given all of the attention to these 20+ lawsuits, I guess I was wondering, on the flip side, given the history with the endangerment finding, is there any potential for lawsuits to help, and by saying this isn't ambitious enough, or for kind of parallel legal efforts to cast authority on the EPA that they should be doing something?
Okay, then one last question.
Mine is about phasing from the situation we're in now to 3 years plus out, where you've got enormous amounts of renewable energy and storage at very low costs coming online.
I'll just say for the second one, Ralph Cavanagh was here last week or the week before, and his view was This is just putting in place what we know is already going to happen. And I think that was your comment. We know that there's already a lot of development going on renewables, storage costs are going down. So is this really going to change anything or not? Or as Michael said, well, maybe not immediately, but in the longer term, it could set up an entire system that could have very dramatic changes.
On the litigation question, I think many of the major environmental groups with strong legal teams are shifting into EPA defense mode. And they're going to be joining the lawsuit in the DC Circuit and vigorously defending, as will a large number of states, EPA actions on climate.
Okay, one last time, thank you.